Okay, well, it looks like we're good to go, so we'll get started. Good afternoon and good morning to everyone from coast to coast, and welcome to today's webinar, Out with the Old, Creating a New Paradigm Around the Fate of Your Buildings. This will be an interview-style session featuring Jim Kadamus, Senior Advisor for Sightlines, and Tony Calcado, Senior Vice President of Institutional Planning and Operations at Rutgers University. My name is Eric Nolan. I'm the Senior Marketing Manager at Sightlines, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. I'll be moderating today's session as Jim and Tony discuss the importance of facilities securing a seat at the table to engage campus leadership in a more focused and strategic conversation about space allocation, and ultimately what this meant for driving change at Rutgers University, which just so happened to also be in the middle of the largest merger in the history of U.S. higher education. Now, before we get started, I'd like to express how thrilled we are to have Tony join us today as our interviewee. Tony has been with Rutgers University for almost 25 years, and due to the recent consolidation of Rutgers with its regional campuses and the former University of Medicine and Dentistry of New Jersey, Tony currently leads one of the largest facilities organizations in the country. Tony was a key member of the team heading up the consolidation and frequently provides expansive knowledge and experience on facilities issues at industry conferences, and most recently, Sightlines' annual Insight Summit member event. Jim, who joined Sightlines over 10 years ago as our Vice President after working more than 30 years in New York State and local government, has worked with Tony and Rutgers for many years and has presented with Tony on a number of occasions. So we're excited to have the opportunity to connect them both again today. We know that you all enjoy the engaging discussion between these two industry leaders. So a big thank you to both Jim and Tony. Now let's quickly review today's agenda. First is a quick overview of Sightlines and our database. Then Jim will provide a brief review of the 2015 facilities trends from our recently released State of Facilities report. This will lead him into discussing Rutgers' story with Tony and the data that was used to make the case that a paradigm shift was needed on their campus. At that point, we'll officially kick off the Q&A to explore what strategies were adopted at Rutgers, how campus constituents engaged in the conversation, and what were the expected outcomes. And with this in mind, I'd like to remind you all that if you have any questions or comments during the presentation for either Jim or Tony, please don't hesitate to share those with us. We'd like this to be an interactive session, and we very much look forward to answering any questions that come up along the way. I'll be monitoring them throughout the presentation, and we'll do our best to address each and every one of them towards the end of each section. To submit a question or comment, simply enter it into the questions box on your GoToWebinar window pane, and they will be sent directly to us. To answer one question up front that we typically receive, following today's session, each of you will receive an email that contains links to both the presentation slides and the webinar recording for your continued engagement with this material. So keep an eye out for that email tomorrow. So before I transition this over to Jim to get us started on the key facilities trends, I'd like to provide a quick overview of where all of our data and insights come from. Where does it originate? Well, we have an international client base in the U.S. and Canada that includes about 340 ROPA Plus members. You can see the breakdown on the screen of our membership includes flagships, publics, privates, state systems, and campuses really both large and small across North America. The growth of this database and our experiences and knowledge of best practices has really been the engine behind our insights, our national thought leadership, and the impact that we're having on campuses. Some key metrics that demonstrate the depth of our ROPA Plus database is that it currently consists of about 1 billion gross square feet of space and over $15 billion in capital and operating budgets, plus operating metrics on roughly 40,000 buildings and 50,000 staff members. So over the past 2 years, in fact, we've added over 100 new campuses to our membership and database, so the facilities intelligence tools that we provide continue to become more powerful. And this toolkit that we offer is rigorously designed to help drive a new facilities conversation on our members' campuses and lead to an alignment of strategies across the institution that connects the dots between space, capital, and operating policies. Some of these interrelated strategies include releasing hidden value from your existing facilities and making critical informed decisions on renovating or demolishing buildings that are well beyond their useful life and do not support institutional priorities anymore. I think you're going to hear a lot about this as Jim and Tony begin to share Rutgers' story today. Then ensuring your capital allocation strategies and multi-year investment plans support the mission of the institution to really mitigate any long-term risk. And the combination of these two initiatives around space and capital will result in lower operating costs and a more proactive facilities management on campus. We firmly believe that making real change on campus requires developing clearly defined policies around these three areas. And through our Work Plus model, which is fueled by the data and metrics discussed previously, we've been able to help our members unite facilities operations and capital investment with institutional mission, utilize predictive analytics, and ultimately tell their facility story as effectively as possible. You're going to hear a lot of these things come through when Jim shares the latest national trends and certainly in elements of Rutgers' story as well. And with that, I'll wrap up here and I'll pass it off to Jim to get us started. So take it away, Jim.
Thank you very much, Eric. I want to first start with a quick overview of the 2015 State of Facilities in Higher Education. A few months ago, we did do a full webinar on this, and it is available online on our website, and you can get a full recording of it. But just some of the highlight slides that help us transition into looking at the Rutgers situation. The first is what's happening with space and enrollment growth. And what we saw from 2007 to 2011 is a rapid increase in enrollment at colleges and universities throughout the United States, and that has now leveled off in aggregate. There are clearly some areas of the country where there still continues to be enrollment growth, but by and large, we're seeing either a leveling or a drifting down of that growth of enrollment, yet we're continuing to see a growth in space. Now, in some cases, that growth in space was decided upon in 2011 and 12 and is just getting constructed and online in 13 and 14, and we'll see if in fact we see a leveling off as our 15 data is aggregated up across our campuses throughout the country. But we're seeing that right now space is outpacing enrollment growth by a few percentage points. It's not tremendously out of whack, but in some campuses there has been some significant building and the enrollment growth is not there to continue to support and bring in the revenue to deal with some of the debt that campuses have undertaken. One of the other metrics we've been tracking is space per student. This is a graphic that looks at both public and private. The public is in red, the private is in yellow. Private campuses tend to have more space per student. They tend to be a little bit smaller in general, but both trends are, as you can see, drifting up. There is more space per student now in 2014 than there was in 2007 by in the range of around 25 or so students per, or gross square students per, or space per 25 gross square feet per student. So we're seeing this gradual growth, this adding of space, and as the enrollment is leveled off, one of the questions that's raised is there some space that maybe you don't need that is in poor condition and maybe we can think about living without, and that's one of the big questions when we talk about Tony about in a few minutes on the Rutgers situation. The other trend we're seeing is the aging of buildings. You can see here from on the left-hand side is the construction age by typical under 10 to 25 years, 25 to 50, and 50 years. And then renovation age. Sightlines calculates renovation age when a building has, or 50% of the replacement value of a building has been replaced and major systems have been reset. So essentially, the clock has been reset on a building and it acts like a younger building as a result of the renovation. You can see where the concentration of effort has been on those over 50-year-old buildings. Construction age, 37% of the buildings on our database, those 40,000 buildings that Eric talked about, were built more than 50 years ago. Renovation age, it's only about 24%. But you can see that 25 to 50 range has stayed about the same, and partly because of the sort of building boom of the 60s and 70s. Those buildings now are in their 40 to close to 50 years old, and many of them will turn 50 over the next 10 years, and those buildings we've kind of gotten to those buildings. We've gotten to the ones that are really old, but we haven't really gotten to those 25 to 50, and we're finding in many cases those buildings were poorly constructed. You know what they are, the flat roof, casement window, brick buildings that you have on most of your campuses, and you're having difficulty with because they were not built very well to start with, and they've not held up with time. And I think one of the reasons we're seeing that not much movement in that particular group of buildings is people are still deciding what to do with them. The iconic buildings were built in the 20s and 30s. You know, people want to keep those on campuses, but some of these 60s and 70s buildings, there's still a lot of questions. Do we renovate them? Do we knock them down and replace them with something else? Capital investment's an interesting picture. There's a big difference between public and private campuses on our database in terms of capital investment. 2009 for both groups was the high point, and then there was a drop as a result of the recession in 2010 and cutting of budgets. And there's been some ramping back up, but as you can see, the public is still even below the 2009 after being above it for a few years. The private, for the first time in 2014, is exceeding the 2009 levels. What's interesting is to see how private colleges are doing this, primarily by growing annual capital or institutional commitment to capital, not by growing debt and borrowing in one-time capital. As you look at the 2014 on the private colleges, one-time capital is $4.44. It's about what it was in 2008, but annual capital that's coming from the institutional budget has gone from about $1.63 in 2009 to $2.82. So a significant increase. Campuses kind of saying we've got a budget for this now. Something that Sightlines preaches through our annual stewardship idea. And we've even seen some growth in the public sector on that, although not as much as we have seen on the public sector. As a result of this aging of buildings, the building of additional space, the lack of capital investment, backlogs have been growing. Public a little faster than private, but still significant on both. Public institutions do have a backlog that's approaching $100 a square foot. Private around $80 a square foot, so some of that larger capital investment of privates has made a difference here, but the reality is that both of them have seen growth in backlog since 2007, and we don't see that changing anytime soon. We do see it changing for some individual institutions that have set priorities and are trying to attack this in a more systematic way. Finally, last couple pieces are the operating budget. There's not been much relief in operating budgets. As you take a look at this metric, from 2008 to 2012, operating budgets almost stayed exactly the same. There was no growth in them. That means that even with inflationary increases in salaries and in healthcare costs, there really wasn't an increase on a square foot basis on operating budgets. We also think that in a lot of cases, space was added, but no additional staff was added, and so as a result, there's not that kind of growth on a dollar per square foot basis. There's been a little bit of recovery the last couple of years, and some recovery in plan and preventive maintenance also. As you could see, we're down in the 28, 29, 30 cents a square foot area back in the late 2000, first decade of the 2000s. Now we're up to about 35 cents a square foot. Two other things that reflects that budget situation, staffing coverage rates that we're seeing in the custodial area nationally, as well as both public and private, some drifting up in the amount of space that people are asked to cover, which means fewer staff people in custodial. And we're also seeing some drifting down of cleanliness scores, not significant, but it's there. And so some concern that as a result of having less staff, there is less cleanliness in campuses. In addition, we take a look at the same kind of metrics for maintenance coverage. We did not put the repair scores on here because they've actually not changed, but we do see that national averages have gone up in terms of coverage rates, again, both in public and in private. I think what's interesting to a lot of people with this metric is that actually private colleges have higher rates of coverage, about 90,000, than public. So there's not a big difference, even though typically most people think private schools maybe spend more money than public schools. From a staffing and operations standpoint, it's pretty similar. And so all of these metrics now suggest kind of take us to the Rutgers story, because I think that Tony, I'm going to ask you to start jumping in here. You know, the Rutgers situation is in very much kind of magnified situation of some of these national trends. Just a few things about Rutgers as to introducing their situation. It's a Large public university, has 67,000 students, is a main campus in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Recently had a merger of the Biomedical and Health Sciences campus in Newark, as well as the University Medical and Dental Institution. They have regional campuses across the state, 27 million square feet, over 1,000 buildings, 1,500 acres of land maintained. So Tony's got a real challenge as he looks at this total institutional profile.
We're celebrating our 250th birthday this year, and we predate the United States of America in that way. And sometimes it feels like some of our buildings also predate the United States of America.
And we'll get into that in a minute. Just a little bit about Rutgers, a couple of facts first on space. We're going to look at both space, capital, and operations for Rutgers first to kind of help define the situation. This is the student growth we've seen since 2008, so similar metric to what I showed you on our state of facilities. And here's the space growth. And so Rutgers has been a little different. As I showed you nationally, space is outpacing the growth of students now, but not at Rutgers. There's still a lot more students than there are space in terms of growth rate, yet they've been able to add about 10% additional space, but about 20% more students. Secondly, when we look at that construction age, the average age of Rutgers is about 50 years old, similar to the Big Ten peers from a construction standpoint. The renovation age is around 49, so there's not been enough money to reset the clock on lots of buildings, more done at their Big Ten peers. And when we take a look at overall Rutgers against Big Ten, you'll see Rutgers is about a little bit over 70% of their space is over 25 years old. In the Big Ten schools, it's about 65%. So Rutgers is a little older than Big Ten peers, although a lot of the Big Ten campuses are older campuses, which means they have a lot more higher risk. They have more higher risk space to deal with. And the last piece on space, which I think is a very telling thing, is the average size of the buildings at Rutgers, about 15,000 square feet. The average size at Big Ten institutions, almost 60,000 square feet. And when we take a look at how those look, you can see that about 70% of the buildings at Rutgers are under 10,000 square feet. So when you think about a big institution like Rutgers, you don't think of a lot of small buildings, but they only amount to about 15% of their square footage, and they're older buildings. So my first question to Tony is, wow, this is a very different profile than we see at a lot of big institutions. Talk a little bit about how Rutgers got there and what are some of the challenges it presents to you.
So Rutgers was built initially as a small liberal arts college. It was a private institution until the mid-1950s, 1956. So in being built that way, that's the profile that was used at the time. So we wind up with 70% of our buildings, and if you think about that, we have 1,000 buildings, a little over 1,000, so 700 of those are under 10,000 square feet. All of us in this business now realize and fully understand that everything starts with space. Space is our biggest expense because our payroll in our divisions work into space. The costs of keeping up and maintaining it are all costs of space. The cost to carry it on the books are costs of space, and the cost to heat it and cool it are costs of space. So that is ultimately, and we've heard people say, well, you know, payroll is the biggest piece. Well, payroll is dictated by your space. So your space is what drives your costs. And how you can corral those costs within that space, or maybe how you can corral that space in order to drive lower costs is where the real trick is, I think.
Yeah. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what you're doing about that in a minute, but we want to try to further define the problem. And so I'm going to look at capital investment. And here is a typical ROPA analysis that's done for Rutgers. We've been working with Rutgers all the way back. We've got data all the way back to 2000. So for the last 16 years, you can see that only 2 of the years was Rutgers able to get enough capital dollars to get into our target range, and then there was a very lean period of time from around 2004 to 2010 where virtually you were only getting about halfway to the target zone. That's gotten a little bit better in the last few years, but certainly still way below where we think that should be relative to targets, and as a result, you can see that the growth in even over the last 5 years in backlog has been significant, about 25% at Rutgers, compared to the other Big Ten, which has only gone up about 15% or so. Second thing is when we look at the spending profile, in the last few years there's been some attention to new space spending at Rutgers, more than there was in the past and more than some of the Big Ten peers. And in part, some of that, I think, Tony, has been renovation through replacement, right? People have brought in some space to replace buildings that were really aging out and where you've made a determination that they just weren't useful for the mission of Rutgers. So do you want to comment a little bit
some of that was, but let's remember also that this was one of the few, and certainly within the last 25 years, the only time where the state actually had a bond issue where it carried some of those costs. Because on our own, we would not have been able to do that.
Great, good. And then let's go to the last set of metrics, which are the coverage metrics. And, you know, Rutgers, from a maintenance standpoint, very similar to what we saw in the national trends, have pretty significant rise in coverage rates from just under 80,000 to close to 100,000 square feet per FTE, which means you've got fewer people covering that space. And custodial has gone up also at same kind of similar pace to what we're seeing nationally. And so this suggests that your operating budgets have been pretty tight relative to the growth in space, and you're trying to do a lot more with less with the staff that you have. Let's talk for a few minutes about how you've been thinking about restructuring your maintenance custodial operations as a result of not having the dollars to deal with the space.
So there are a couple of different strategies. First and foremost, you're right. The additional budgetary dollars for new space are offset by the cuts in our budgetary dollars for existing space. So we're essentially dealing with the same money and more space to deal with. There's no doubt about that. So some of the strategies that we need to start to look at are better training of our staff, looking at and documenting very carefully what it is that we do on a daily basis, and you really have to stick to it being that standard and no more than that standard. And of course, that comes with the whole communication piece that goes to that goes out to the community. Another strategy that is critically important is to modernize the equipment that the staff is doing. That's a one-time cost. So if you're modernizing anything from backpack vacuum cleaners to their ability to get from building to building, it just makes the work that much easier, and it's easier for custodians to be able to cover more space at that time. In addition to, of course, we've implemented an integrated work management system so that all of the different areas talk to each other. So technology plays a part, modernization of equipment plays a part, documentation of exactly what it is that you're going to do on any given day plays a part. So all of those things play a part.
Yeah, let me follow up with one other question on this, because one of the questions that we hear from people is, well, what happens when you begin to maybe do less for the customers, not be as responsive on some of the maintenance coverage or the expectations about the cleanliness? How you mentioned communication, and so talk for a few minutes about how you've communicated those expectations to your campus community such that they now understand what they're going to get for their money, essentially.
So it starts at the top, and you need to communicate with your chief academic officer and your president to make sure that the expectations are clearly understood. It requires that that the services that you're going to be providing be outlined in their entirety and explicit, so that there's no misunderstanding and no mistake as to what it is that you'll be doing on a daily basis. Then you need to start working your way down. Deans, vice presidents, deans, department chairs, and if necessary, getting right into faculty meetings and having that conversation. This also includes the student side. So your student governing association, town halls, those types of activities. So it is a full court press when it comes to communication, and it requires that people in our positions, my position, and those that report to me and those that are in charge of maintenance and in charge of operations, it requires that they have a lot of interaction with every member of the community, because if you try and just put it on a chief academic officer or a dean and you hand them this information or talk to them only, that information will never filter down. It has to be boots on the ground. It has to be knocking on those doors, and you need to have those conversations and build those relationships, because those are the people that become your biggest advocates.
So Tony, two stories that I love at Rutgers that maybe you can tell a little bit, as we've got a couple of minutes before we get into some of the broader strategies, is what you do about emptying the trash and what you do about plantings and your flower carts. And so could you talk about those two stories, because I think our audience would love to hear those two.
So, we pick up trash in offices once a week. That's it. So we have common areas for trash, and of course those are picked up on a daily basis, but this is part of the standard. So we have a robust recycling program, and we just wind up with a very small trash receptacle in every office. And we make it very clear to the community that if you intend on eating lunch in your office, and on a Monday you want to have that banana and you throw that in your trash in your office, no one's going to come to the rescue until Friday. And when we get there, we can assure you that that office is really going to smell very much like a banana, and I'm pretty sure you'll have a lot of fruit flies around that as well. So we do not deviate from that. That is what it is. It may smell inside an office and starting to come out from under the door, but we're not going to go in there and pick up any of your trash. Years ago, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, we would plant, starting right now, pansies across the campus, as many as 20,000 plants that would be planted. And unfortunately, over time, we've not been able to do that anymore. So one of the tricks that we do, if I can call it that, is we do flowers on a cart. Much like elementaries do art on a cart, we do flowers on a cart. So we have these beautiful large planters that we put on wheels, and we take them from event to event, drive them around, place them out front. Once the event is done, or it doesn't matter really what it is, we pick them up, bring them back to a warehouse, take care of them, greenhouse type of effect, and then take them out for the next time. And that's one of the strategies that we employ versus trying to plant flowers everywhere we can. So while the grounds now are probably neater and tidier than they ever have been, it's a vast simplification from what we did 20 years ago or 15 years ago, or even, 15 years ago. By 10 years ago, we had already stopped planting because it was a reality of what these budget cuts would cost. So it was not just the cost of the flowers, it was the cost of the labor, and now it's not even a matter of the cost of the labor because we no longer even have that labor available to us. So those are the types of things that we would do. It's amazing what you could do, for instance, with some curtains, and how much misery can be hidden when it comes to events or when you're trying to hide something and just make it appealing to the eye. And those are strategies, unfortunately, that we do have to put in place.
Yeah. Well, ones that I think I get a lot of people asking about, particularly the trash. I've had a lot of campuses say to me, if we ever decided we weren't going to pick up the trash every day, we'd have war on our hands. But somehow you've been able to get buy-in to that. And,
so again, that was a massive communication effort. That was an effort when we switched to these little hanging baskets on the sides of our trash cans, and the rest is all recyclable. There were some people that would make fun. There were some people that just were beside themselves because we weren't picking up trash every day and we weren't vacuuming in offices every day. But the realities were what the realities were, and we would sit with individual departments, and we would sit with all the individual deans and anyone who was interested in talking to us, and sometimes even if they weren't interested in talking to us, we would make our way into their place of business so that they fully understood what it was that we were trying to accomplish and why we needed to go to this system of cleaning. It's where can you make the sacrifice is what it comes down to. So there are certain areas you're not touching. You need to be there every day. You need to be there sometimes 2 and 3 times a day, depending on your traffic, things like restrooms, of course. But there are also areas that we were just cleaning too much in the end.
I want to point out also to our audience, because we do track repair and cleanliness scores, that actually the cleanliness scores at Rutgers have actually gone up over the last few years, and the ground scores have gone up over the last few years because there's been basically more focused and effort, and you're not wasting time on things that don't matter. So, it's not as though things are much worse. In fact, things look better, and the customer satisfaction has grown too.
Yeah, and even on our ground side, we've gone to, we have lots of acreage that we would mow, and now we've gone to wildflowers and low mow and no mow areas, and just do borders around streets. And you know what? It's been a great success. People actually love it. And now that the wildflowers have taken hold, and it's just, it's a pretty sight over the spring and summer, and even into the fall.
Great. Eric, I want to see if there's any questions before we move into the next section. If anybody's asked a question that you want to pose to me or Tony before we get into the next section, where we look at broader strategies that Rutgers has pursued to create this new paradigm.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions that came in. The first is for you, Jim, and it goes back to the enrollment growth trends that you shared in the previous section.
Sure.
They're asking, are you able to predict future enrollment growth nationwide, and how can historic data help with future decisions?
Yeah, we are able to look at least traditional K-12 enrollments across the country, and in most cases, certainly in the East and in the Midwest and the Atlantic coast areas, they will be continuing drifting down until about 2020, where they begin to turn but not come back to where they were back in the 2007-8 peak periods. In places like Texas, Utah, Arizona, we're seeing, and to some extent Florida, we're seeing some continued growth in some of those K-12 populations, and so you're going to see a little different situation there. California's been very stable. There's not been a huge growth in the population over the last few years, and we don't anticipate there will be much growth. So nationwide, I think these numbers will continue to drift down a little bit between now and 2020, and then slowly come back, but not back to where they were in the 2007 era. So I think you're looking at a decade or more here of enrollment stability, but not necessarily a growth comeback, which suggests that if you've built space up anticipating a growth in enrollment, maybe time to start looking at some of the buildings that maybe you don't need in the future.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Next question is for Tony. What will happen to the large lecture halls on college campuses on the Rutgers campus? Data shows these spaces are significantly underutilized and will be as online learning continues to grow. So does Rutgers have a plan to repurpose these large spaces for alternative uses, and what are some ideas to think about through this change?
So I don't believe that the large lecture halls will go anywhere, because there is a great economy of savings by providing those 101 courses and the 110 courses. So I think that they would remain there, the large lecture halls. What we're looking at here at Rutgers actually is a little bit of a different strategy. We move a lot of people around on any given day. So our buses do about 90,000 trips a day. 90,000 people a day from Mondays through Thursday. And what we want to do is alleviate some of that pressure, especially between the hours of 4 and 7. So what we want to do is do some simultaneous or synchronous classroom use, so that we would be teaching the same course on 2 or 3 different campuses, so we don't have to move people as much as we do. But I don't believe that the large lecture halls, especially at this point in time, will go anywhere. They're here to stay for some time.
Okay, thanks, Tony. We have one more question for Tony on the custodial side of the house. How many shifts do you employ? When are classrooms cleaned? There's several questions here. Do you use part-time employees, and do you use student employees to clean or assist with setups?
We have a number of shifts. We have a 5:30 to 1:30 shift, that's the primary shift. We have a shift that runs the afternoon into the evening. We have a late night shift, but we do not have an overnight shift. So how it's staffed is dependent. The bulk of our staffing is 5:30 to 1:30. Usually most of the classrooms are cleaned before the opening, and with our night shift in the evening. We do use part-timers. We do not use students for cleaning. We find that to be a terribly unreliable workforce. But part-timers we do use.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Tony. That's all the questions we have so far.
Good. So let's. So I want to transition, Tony, now to this whole question of how do you connect space capital and operations. It's been sort of a theme that Eric introduced here, and certainly, Rutgers with its smaller, older buildings, the underfunding that's led to the backlog, the strain on operations. You experience all three of those, and so that's what's driven this whole concept of a new paradigm. And so I want to start first with. You mentioned communications and the importance of getting the campus leadership team on board. So can you talk a little bit about how you've been able to get a seat at the table and some of the outcomes that have resulted from that?
So I think it almost works in reverse. The seat at the table came from the fact that that we were and are and continue to be in operations, specifically in facilities, the largest expense at the university. So again, I'll go back to it's all tied into space. It's all tied into heating and cooling that space. It's all tied into cleaning that space and maintaining that space. So we're the largest seat at the table. I think that the light bulb has finally gone off in many senior administrators' minds, and what I'm talking about here are chief academic officers and presidents, for the most part, and chancellors, that the importance of what the operational units do at the university. So, first of all, we're a big expense, the biggest expense, and the biggest expense that you could actually go after and try and make some cuts to, because that won't happen with your tenured side of the table or the academic side of the table. Secondly, you're looking at the appeal of the college or university. We're a big business today, and appeal sells. And curb appeal is the number one reaction or number one component when people pull up to your front door, right? So how it looks is going to have an immediate impact on your decision as a consumer as to whether you want to be here or don't want to be here, right? So there's the old saying, you only get one shot at making a first impression, and that is absolutely true in our business. These are the types of strategies needed to be employed when speaking to presidents, chancellors, chief academic officers, and show them, literally show them, the importance of this operational unit to the functioning of the university. And then let's take it one step further. Not only is it important when you're looking at R1s, for instance, it's all about how are those labs maintained? How can they do research if we don't do this right? And so that story needs to be continually told to the point that it's beaten into people's heads, and I hate to use that dramatic a term, but beaten into people's heads so they understand that we need to be talked to, and we're not a force that can be just relegated to the curb anymore. This is a force that makes a difference in how we, or how the university, the college or university, operates on a daily basis. And I tell my staff all the time, nothing happens here at Rutgers University without us. The toilets don't flush, the lights don't come on, the water doesn't run, it doesn't matter. Everything that happens at a university happens on the back of its operations staff. So that's what gets you a seat at the table. And then showing that you have ideas on how to have a more positive effect on the university by creating efficiencies and effectiveness on how we operate.
One thing on this graphic that we've got up now, Tony, I think is really interesting is that how you've been able to balance for your project coordination between those core facility needs, like making sure the envelope is watertight, making sure that the building systems are upgraded, but also not ignoring the space. And I think most of our clients and the audience, I think, struggles with the idea of how do you balance those core facility investments for what's behind the walls and what's on the roof versus the deans and the provost who really want commitment to space. And it looks like you've done a pretty nice job using this graphic on that. Comment on that for a minute.
Sure. So we try and use the holistic approach. When we sit down with our clients and they want to talk about space renewal, we point out to them that, well, what is the point of our building you out a beautiful new suite or a beautiful new lab if we can't keep it dry, if it's leaking on your head and everything that you're putting in and it's going to be ruined in no time whatsoever. So at that point, what we try and do is really mix and match funding so that we can get the biggest bang for our buck. So it's a holistic approach that we take at it. It's not always easy. It's not a science. It's an art form. Again, it comes down to communication, and it comes down to building relationships with those deans, directors, customers that you try and help to understand that it's not as simple as giving you a paint job and putting in new furniture.
Yeah. One of the areas that you've been effective in getting in place here is this concept of no net new space policy. That is, for when buildings are built, something else is going to ultimately come down. And that is one that is, we're really seeing a number of campuses consider, but everybody tells us it's a huge struggle, a very tough sell. Can you talk a little bit about that conversation at Rutgers?
Sure. So this comes from the fact that that we have a seat at the table. So one of the stories that gets told a lot is with 27 million square feet, it's not really that we need more buildings. It's the type and quality of the buildings that make a difference. So with the support of the president and the chief academic officer, a decision was made about 2 years ago that what we would start to do is every time we put up a new building, what we were looking at doing was quite literally taking something offline. So it's not a 1 square foot per 1 square foot. Something needs to come down. Something needs to come offline. That has to be part, and this is another new strategy we've done, that has to be part of our business plan. So every new building has a business plan associated with it. How is that going? How's the debt service going to be treated? Where's the O&M going to come from? So some of the strategies that are used, for instance, if you take down a building, you can reassign or reapply that O&M to your new building. Now, we understand fully that something that goes up for arts and sciences, typically there's no money to be made in arts and sciences. In the sciences themselves or in research, there is money to be made, and there's F&A return and all kinds of good things that you can apply to a business plan. But what we're trying to do is apply practicality, right? A practical look at this is the way that business is done everywhere, and higher education needs to start looking through those lenses, or we will be out of business. And it's easy enough to see when you look at articles that are in the Chronicle and what's happening across the country, especially with enrollment numbers and where people are going.
And when we look at the cost structure in this particular slide, the under 10,000 square feet, which are 70% of your buildings, have a maintenance cost that runs almost 3 times the cost of the larger building. And so it just costs more to maintain those smaller buildings, and you got a lot of them.
Yes. And, when 70% of your buildings are those smaller buildings, it becomes a real daily struggle on how to maintain them. Even just how to get people from one building to the next is a struggle.
So getting rid of them.
Inefficient.
Yeah, so taking some of them down and getting rid of them is a real broad strategy. Let's turn to a second strategy I think people are very interested in. That is your RCM model, your Responsibility Center Management model, where people actually pay for space. I know a lot of the campuses out there listening today are thinking about this, and some are very nervous about this trend, and I know Rutgers has moved to this. Talk a little bit about how it has happened and what's been the reaction.
Again, the paradigm shift within higher education. So not a new concept. There are schools that have been doing this for the last 20 years. So places like University of Pennsylvania, for instance. What this essentially is the money's redistributed. It's really turned over to the deans. I think that's probably the easiest way I could say it, to the different schools. and centers potentially, and those schools are now responsible for that budget. So and what that means is that they will be billed for everything that they get. So we are a central expense. When I say we, we're talking about facilities, it's essential expense, the operations, utilities, and there is a cost associated for that central expense, and it's based on a square foot model. So it's X amount per square foot, and what will happen is that the dean will have to pay back for that space, and whether he's using it or not. So a big fallout from this now is all of a sudden people are looking at just how much space do I need, and do I need all that I have, and if I don't, then I'm going to turn it back because I get to keep my money and I can use it in other places versus, you know, having the luxury of space that I never had to pay for before. So it's a big, it's a shift, it's a huge shift, but it certainly is an incentive as well.
People are worried, at least that I've talked to, about the accounting of all of this stuff, and do you think it's more complicated to do it this way than the traditional budget process?
It is more accountable, is I think what I would say, than the traditional budget process. So it is there. I mean, this is what we have finance departments for, and while it's a little scary, I don't think it's really any different than the accounting that you had to do for all funds budgeting than you have to do in RCM. The trick in RCM is to make sure that you've captured all your costs and that they are in the correct allocated pools. So that's really where it can get a little tricky, but that's a matter of potentially running a shadow system and then coming back and doing the implementation once you can see where the variances are.
Does this also include utility costs, Tony?
It does. It includes utility costs as well.
Okay. So we'll talk a little bit about classroom utilization in the RCM model, and one of the things that you've been doing at Rutgers is really getting very serious about classroom utilization, scheduling, and controls, and so let's expand a little bit about how you've approached this and what the outcomes have been.
So our classroom utilization numbers, of course, all of our utilization turns out to be, you know, between Mondays and Thursdays and Fridays an off day. Again, I think that this is a complete paradigm shift. We need to smooth the schedule, and we need to begin to use 5 days a week. So that is much like the trash. No one wants to hear that story, but the fact of the matter is that you cannot keep, if you think about it, 20% of your time not being used. It's just not being used. So Fridays are basically empty in every classroom. Even with that, our classroom utilization had fallen to somewhere around, it was in the 60s, the percentage, and part of it is because many of the departments would consider certain classrooms theirs, and they would not give them up and not let anyone else use them. So they would be empty for half the week, because only certain courses were being taught in those those classrooms. What we've done is literally go back to the different departments and say, look, if you put this into general use, we'll give you first dibs at it, but more importantly, we will maintain it. And by maintaining it, I mean the IT upgrades, those types of things, because normally we keep the maintenance on them irrespective, and that's mostly custodial maintenance, but we'll make them in the same type of classroom that you have across the campuses, and you'll have better IT equipment, you'll have better audio-visual equipment. And so now with RCM, because that's the double whammy, what will happen, and what we fully expect to happen, is that we'll start to see those classrooms, and we actually have started to see that, return to the general pool. People are making those deals, they're giving them up, and they're getting first dibs at them, and they're getting a better classroom for it. That enables us to up our numbers on classroom utilization. That enables us to spread the schedule across a little bit easier, and to get more efficient use out of our buildings, because we're still cleaning them, we're still maintaining them, we're still doing all the things that it costs money to do, whether they're empty or whether they're full of students and people.
Very challenging issue for everyone and a very interesting change in the paradigm, and I think a lot of people would like to shift that. And then finally, the last piece that I want to talk to you before we see if there's any other questions, talk to you about, Tony, is this whole interrelationship. You know, what we've heard from you is the divesting of the older space and the smaller buildings, being able to reduce the backlog because of that, freeing up capital, allowing your operations to be more proactive, economies of scale in bigger buildings. But I'd like to get a little bit more of your perspective on how you think about these together, because I think that's what we Sightlines is trying to do more and more for our clients, is to get them to understand that these three circles do not operate in isolation.
So these, you're absolutely correct. These three circles feed off of each other. And I would venture to say, literally, you start with that space circle, and you need to get a good handle on that space utilization, not just by way of what is in the space, but by way of what the potential for the space is. That really drives how much money on the capital side you need to put in there and how much it's going to cost you to keep maintaining it. And some difficult decisions need to be made. There's no way to begin to reduce your deferred maintenance backlog, and that's a term we talk about a lot in our business, our deferred maintenance backlog. You're not going to be able to reduce it by just throwing money at it. It'll never happen. You'll never catch up. When we look at your numbers, Jim, where we're talking about, you know, probably 50% of the buildings across America are 50 years and better, there's not enough money to continue to throw at that to solve the problem. What solves the problem is that plant size needs to get smaller and buildings need to get smarter. And they need to get a little larger, dare I say. And that's where you'll get more effective operations within those buildings. You'll get better use of that space, and you'll reduce the amount of capital dollars that you need to continue to put into those buildings.
Well, I hope that we've given our audience here, Tony, some food for thought. Certainly, every time I talk to you, I really get some new insights, and many times I've had a chance to present with you, and you've really given us some insights and some really different way of thinking about facilities and a different paradigm, and Rutgers continues to do that and continues to be challenged by all of these issues. Eric, I want to turn to you and see if there are a couple more questions. We are at about we're about 5 minutes or so left, and let's see if we've got some questions from the audience that Tony and I can answer.
Yeah, sure. We actually have a ton of questions to address. So if we're unable to, if we don't have the time to get to everything, we are recording all these questions. So if we can't get to it now, we will be responding to that, to your questions after the session is over. But the very first one is, I think for you, Jim, when you have maintenance costs in the slides, does this only include labor and materials for maintenance, cleaning, et cetera, or does this also include utilities?
It does not include utilities. When we just look at our cost of the maintenance, and particularly that dollar per square foot, it was strictly staffing and materials off the work order system, did not include the cost of utilities, and so that was the cost on a square foot basis per work order. Okay,
thank you. Next question is for you, Tony. I think this relates to the RCM model. What is the process for setting and approving rates?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
What is the process for setting and yeah, so this question relates to, I believe, the RCM model, and what is the process for setting and approving rates?
So that's done, actually, there's a collection that finance here for us has done, and we've worked closely with them. It's a collection of all of the costs associated with doing business. So everything's looked at. You know, how much is it for custodial? How much is it for maintenance? How much is material? How much is, you know, average of utilities, for instance? How much does it cost even for project management if that's not paid for, administration? For all of these pieces, all of those pieces are pooled together, and then from there it's a simple math issue as to how much is attributed or how much per square foot that comes out to. The difference is, what do you put in a certain allocation and what is not in a certain allocation, and those then are conversations. Some schools in their facilities allocation have everything from insurance through toilet paper. Some, it's not, it's a little looser, and maybe insurance is in a finance cost and risk management's in a finance cost. So, but all the expenses at the university are captured, typically captured through the accounting process, controller's office, and then you look at a square footage divisor amongst those costs.
Okay. All right, thank you. Next question for you, Tony. It's looks like it's a three-parter. It relates to the classroom utilization strategies. First question is, how are you measuring utilization of research labs, and what do you expect as a baseline for classroom utilization rates?
So I can tell you that utilization of research labs is productive grants per researcher. So if you have a researcher that has a 5,000 square foot research lab and hasn't brought a grant in the last 5 years, there's time to that chancellor or that dean has to have a serious conversation. So you start to line up grant value per lab, and you start to get a very clear picture of what seems to be going on. Now, we're not talking about teaching labs, we're talking about research labs. Teaching labs a whole other story. That's, per period and how often they get they're occupied for teaching purposes. I think the other part to that question was about the baseline. We don't baseline against anyone, we baseline against ourselves. So what we're looking at is improvement year over year in what the utilization is. So we're not really, it's almost kind of for us irrelevant as to what the industry may be doing, what our peers may be doing by way of utilization, because we're not sure how they really count it. And so it doesn't become all that important to us. It's more important to us to look at our numbers and say, I'm just throwing out a number here. It's 50% this year, and we want to get to 53% next year and 56%. So you need a 5-year strategy as to where you want to be, and because every one of those percentage points is worth X in a monetary value.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Next question, I think it's for you, Jim. I think it's back on maybe slide 28, the no net new policy slide. There's a chart there, and the question is, can you explain why buildings between 10,000 and 25,000 square feet had such low costs?
I think what they had is more average costs. I think the real issue was the under 10 buildings where primarily I think it's the age profile that's driving a lot of this. Those under 10,000 square foot buildings, there's low economies of scale in maintaining them. They also, because they're older, when one problem occurs, it's the kind of thing when there's a leak in the bathroom, before you know it, you're busting down the walls. Before you know it, you're bringing a digger in, look at the line coming into the building. And so I think that's another factor in there. The other factor, of course, is that many of them have independent utility systems that don't run on the campus utilities, and so they have their own separate heating systems, and you end up having to, heating and air conditioning systems, having to replace them. So I think it's more of the fact that there's such a differentiation from those smaller buildings compared to everything else, which is relatively the same. There's a little economies of scale there, I think, as you grow larger buildings. But right now, I think what we're seeing is that the one study that we did showed just a dramatic difference when you have so many of these small buildings in terms of operating costs.
Okay, thank you. And the last question that we have here that we'll address while we're on the call, I want to make sure that we got to this one, and it's for both of you. What impact does a poorly managed or understaffed maintenance department have on the overall backlog?
So I can speak to that a little bit. Understaffed and poorly managed, I think two completely different scenarios. Understaffed, you need to put that staff somewhere, and you're going to have to make hard decisions. And if the staff is in if the staff is in daily maintenance, and that's where you need them to be because they're responding to calls, then certainly you're not going to have enough staff to do your planned or your preventative maintenance. Interestingly, we build our organizations really around our preventative maintenance, but we use that staff in our daily maintenance. Because the strategy or the key is if we had good preventative maintenance programs, we should be reducing our daily maintenance and emergency calls drastically. A poorly managed department is a poorly managed department. There's not much you can do with that except to change management. And I, today, these organizations, our organizations, I guess this is the last question, I'll leave you with this thought, are professional organizations. These organizations need professional management. It's no longer, somebody got a job because they knew somebody and, it was a good place to be or whatever it was 30 years ago. These are professional organizations that have an impact on the bottom line of the university. And they have a major impact on the bottom line of the university, whether it's through curb appeal, whether it's through making sure the university can do research, whether it's through the university having a stellar reputation for teaching well. All of those things have a major impact on the bottom line. And so universities need to realize as well now that our staffs need to be professional staffs. And with technology, what it is, when we look at the different strategies by way of just HVAC systems, for instance, it's not for everybody anymore. It's a more educated, it's a more professional staff, and it needs to be treated as such.
The only thing I'd add to that, Eric, is that the evidence that we have is there are not going to be significant increases in operating budgets. You might be able to secure some increases in capital budgets as people see the importance of improving the overall quality of buildings, or as states issue bond acts, or as private sector institutions are able to borrow money at good rates. But we're not seeing in any institution significant increases in operating budgets, which means that you're basically going to have the same operating budget you have now going out, and if you're lucky. And as a result, you need to have better management. Management has to become more strategic. You need to make some of the hard choices that we've heard from Tony. With that, Eric, I want to thank Tony for his time here today. Just outstanding again. Always great to talk with you and interact with you. And I had the joy of asking the questions here, and you haven't put you on the hot seat, but we learn a lot every time we talk with you, and I hope the audience did too. Eric, you want to wrap it up for the group?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, thank you, Jim and Tony. That was great. That wraps up the content of today's session. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to continue submitting those now, and we'll be sure to address those following the conclusion of today's webinar. While we wait for more questions to trickle in, before we sign off, I'd like to let you all know that you will be receiving a post-webinar survey at the conclusion of today's session. That survey is designed to not only get your thoughts on the content of today's presentation, but to also get a sense for the challenges that you face on campus, and really with those in mind, what topics you'd like to hear from Sightlines at future events. I'd also like to make sure I encourage you all to visit the Sightlines website and our Insights page if you'd like to stay current with these trends and in any of the latest best practices or innovative facility solutions that we share. Insights is your resource to easily access industry knowledge from both Sightlines and our member institutions. There you'll find blog posts, articles, webinar recordings where this session will be located, and more information on upcoming events. You'll also have the opportunity to sign up for our monthly newsletter, so please be sure to check that out from time to time as we frequently update this page with new information. So it looks like all questions have been submitted. So again, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. I hope that you enjoyed the session and found the information valuable as you continue to explore ways to create a new facilities conversation on your campus. Please don't hesitate to contact us via our website, sightlines.com, or directly at insights@sightlines.com if you have any additional questions following today's call. So thank you again, and I hope you all have a great day.
Thank you.